I'm Colonel Fletcher, 32, and I earned my rank the unglamorous way, years in logistics keeping Marines supplied, safe, and coming home. For years, I carried my family, backed my sister's rise, and made the wins around me possible. But when my dad patted my head at her promotion and said, "Just don't embarrass her," I drew a line that changed everything. Ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you gave everything to? Tell me in the comments, you're not alone. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being written off, tap like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. But I realized I no longer needed his pride to validate my service. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, but it was irreversible. Dad struggled to rewrite 30 years of family narrative, and sometimes he backslid into old patterns. During holiday gatherings, he'd still introduce Nadia with obvious pride, then catch himself and add details about my military service with visible effort. The correction felt performative rather than natural, but it was progress. Nadia handled the family dynamic shifts with more grace than I'd expected. She could have resented the sudden attention paid to my career, could have felt diminished by the revelation that she wasn't the only military success in our family. Instead, she seemed genuinely curious about my work and supportive of my newfound recognition. "I always knew you were smart," she told me during Thanksgiving dinner. "I just didn't realize how much responsibility you carry." "Dad made sure no one realized," I replied. She nodded thoughtfully. "I think I got so used to being the center of attention that I stopped paying attention to anyone else, including you." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd received from any family member, and it meant more than Dad's belated pride. The most significant change was in how other people interacted with our family. Friends, relatives, and neighbors who'd witnessed Dad's dismissive treatment of me for years had seen the video footage from Nadia's ceremony. They understood now that his casual condescension toward my career had been based on ignorance rather than accurate assessment. At community events, people approached me differently. The local American Legion Post invited me to speak about military logistics. The high school asked me to participate in career day presentations. Parents of military recruits sought my advice about service options for their children. Dad watched these interactions with visible discomfort. His authority as the family's military expert had been challenged by the revelation of my rank and experience. People who'd previously deferred to his opinions about military matters now asked for my perspective instead. "It's strange," he said one evening after we'd attended a veterans fundraiser together. "People keep asking you about military policy like you're some kind of expert." "I am an expert, Dad. In logistics and supply chain management, which affects every aspect of military operations." He was still adjusting to this reality. The awkwardness extended to his relationship with Nadia as well. She'd been his primary source of military credibility, his connection to active service, his proof of successful parenting. Now that connection felt complicated by the knowledge that he'd ignored his other daughter's equally significant military career. Nadia noticed the tension during family gatherings. "He doesn't know how to relate to both of us," she told me after Christmas dinner. "For so long, I was his military daughter and you were something else. Now he's trying to figure out how to be proud of both of us without admitting he was wrong about you." "He was wrong about me," I said simply. "I know. And I think he knows. But admitting it means acknowledging 30 years of dismissing your accomplishments. That's a lot to face." She was right, but I wasn't interested in making things easier for him. I'd spent 3 decades minimizing my achievements to preserve his narrative. I wasn't going to help him construct a new story that absolved him of responsibility for the old one. The changes weren't limited to family dynamics. My professional life shifted as well. The video of the Marine salute had been seen by colleagues and superiors in my own organization. My commanding officers had always respected my work, but the public demonstration of respect from field Marines added weight to my reputation. Within 6 months, I was offered a promotion to full colonel and assignment to a joint task force coordinating logistics for multiple service branches. The position involved briefing senior Pentagon officials, coordinating with NATO allies, and managing supply chains for operations across 3 continents. When I told Dad about the promotion, he tried to respond appropriately. "That's wonderful," he said. "Really impressive. Full colonel. That's the same rank as Nadia's commanding officer, isn't it?" "Higher, actually," I said. "And Nadia's a major, not a colonel." He blinked, still struggling to recalibrate his understanding of military hierarchy and our respective positions within it. The new assignment required me to relocate to Washington, D.C. Dad seemed genuinely distressed by this news, as if my physical distance would make his attempts at rebuilding our relationship even more difficult. "Will you still be able to come home for holidays?" he asked. "When mission requirements allow," I said, which was the same answer I'd always given but now carried different weight. Nadia helped me pack for the move, and we had the most honest conversation we'd ever shared about our family dynamics. "I feel guilty," she admitted while folding my uniforms. "All these years, you were supporting me, helping me succeed, and I just accepted it as normal. It was normal. For our family. But it wasn't right. Dad made you invisible, and I let it happen." I appreciated her acknowledgement, but I wasn't angry with Nadia. She'd been a child when the family roles were established, and children don't question the hierarchies adults create around them. "You couldn't have changed Dad's perspective," I told her. "He saw what he wanted to see. But I could have seen you more clearly. Asked more questions. Paid better attention. Maybe." But Nadia had been living her own life, pursuing her own career, dealing with her own challenges. It wasn't her responsibility to correct Dad's willful blindness about my accomplishments. The week before I left for Washington, Dad asked if we could have dinner together, just the two of us. We met at a restaurant near the base where I'd been stationed, neutral territory that felt less loaded than our family home. "I want to understand," he said after we'd ordered. "Not just your job, but how I got it so wrong for so long." It was a more direct acknowledgement of his mistakes than he'd ever offered before. "You got it wrong because it served your purposes," I said. "You needed Nadia to be the success story and me to be the supporting character. My actual accomplishments didn't fit that narrative, so you ignored them." He was quiet for a moment, turning his beer glass in slow circles on the table. "When those Marines showed up at Nadia's ceremony," he said finally, "I realized I didn't know who you were. My own daughter, and I didn't know who you were. You knew who I was, Dad. You just didn't care." The words were harsher than I'd intended, but they were accurate. He'd had countless opportunities to learn about my work, my responsibilities, my achievements. He'd chosen not to take them. "I cared," he said quietly. I thought I understood what you did. Support work. Important, but not what Nadia did. Right." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us struggling with the weight of 3 decades of misunderstanding. "Is there any way to fix this?" he asked eventually. I looked at him across the table, this man who'd shaped my childhood, who'd taught me to drive and helped me with homework and attended my school events, but who'd somehow managed to remain fundamentally uninterested in my adult achievements until public embarrassment forced his attention. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe. But it would require you to actually see me as I am, not as you want me to be." "I'm trying." "Trying isn't enough anymore, Dad. I spent 30 years trying to get your attention, your recognition, your basic curiosity about my life. I'm done trying. If you want a relationship with me, you'll have to build it on who I actually am." He nodded slowly, understanding that the easy absolution he'd hoped for wasn't coming. The dinner ended cordially but without resolution. Some relationships can be repaired after fundamental betrayals of trust and respect. Others can't. I wasn't sure which category ours fell into, and I was no longer willing to do the emotional work of finding out. My assignment to Washington opened opportunities one hadn't expected. Working directly with Pentagon officials, I found myself in meetings with generals and admirals, briefing senior leadership on logistics capabilities and constraints. My expertise in crisis management and supply chain coordination became essential to strategic planning. Within a year, I was leading briefings for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, explaining how supply line vulnerabilities could impact operational readiness across multiple theaters. The work was demanding, consequential, and precisely aligned with my skills and experience. Dad called regularly during my first months in Washington, asking careful questions about my new role, clearly trying to demonstrate sustained interest in my career. The conversations felt stilted, performative, like he was following a script rather than expressing genuine curiosity. "How's the new job going?" he'd ask. "Challenging. Interesting. High-stakes decision-making." "That sounds important." "It is important, Dad." These exchanges revealed the fundamental problem with our relationship. He was trying to show interest in my work because public embarrassment had taught him it was expected, not because he actually cared about the substance of what I did. Nadia, by contrast, asked detailed questions about my responsibilities, wanted to understand how logistics coordination affected field operations, showed genuine curiosity about the complexity of managing supply chains across multiple combat zones. "Do you ever brief the Secretary of Defense?" she asked during one of our calls. "Monthly. Sometimes weekly during crisis situations." "That's incredible. You're literally influencing national security policy." It was the kind of recognition I'd hoped for from Dad, but had finally stopped expecting. The work itself provided satisfaction that family approval never could. When supply lines stayed operational during complex military exercises, when crisis logistics prevented operational failures, when field commanders received exactly what they needed when they needed it, I knew my decisions had concrete, measurable impact. 2 years into the Washington assignment, I was promoted to brigade commander for Joint Logistics Operations, responsible for coordinating supply chains supporting over 50,000 personnel across 6 countries. The promotion ceremony was smaller than Nadia's had been, limited to Pentagon staff and senior officers. Dad flew to Washington for the event, bringing Mom and Nadia with him. It was the first time he'd attended one of my military ceremonies, and his discomfort was obvious. He didn't know the protocol, didn't understand the significance of the promotion, couldn't contextualize my new rank within military hierarchy. "Brigade commander," he said after the ceremony. "That sounds impressive." "It's a significant responsibility," I agreed. "How many people report to you now?" "Directly? About 30 officers. Indirectly, several thousand personnel across multiple installations." He tried to process this information, clearly struggling to reconcile his image of me as support staff with the reality of my command responsibilities. Nadia was more direct. "You outrank me by a significant margin now," she said with a smile. "How does it feel to be the senior officer in the family?" "It feels normal," I said. "This is what my career trajectory has been for years." Dad overheard the exchange and looked confused. "You outrank Nadia?" "I've outranked Nadia for 3 years, Dad. Since I made full colonel." The information seemed to hit him like a physical blow. For 30 years, he'd positioned Nadia as the family's military authority. The revelation that I'd been the senior officer for years undermined every assumption he'd made about our respective achievements. After the ceremony, we had dinner at a restaurant near the Pentagon. Dad was quieter than usual, clearly processing the disconnect between his perceptions and reality. Mom tried to fill the conversational gaps with questions about my work, my new responsibilities, my living situation in Washington. "Are you happy here?" she asked. "Very. The work is exactly what I'm trained for. Challenging, consequential, well-matched to my skills." "And you're respected? Appreciated?" I glanced at Dad, who was staring at his plate. "Yes, Mom. Very much so." Nadia raised her glass. "To my sister, the brigade commander. I'm proud to serve in the same corps." We toasted, but Dad's participation felt reluctant, obligatory. That evening, he asked if we could walk around the Lincoln Memorial together. It was a warm spring night, and the monuments were dramatically lit against the dark sky. "I keep trying to understand," he said as we climbed the steps. "How I could be so wrong about something so fundamental." "Because you never asked the right questions," I said. "You assumed you understood what I did without bothering to learn the details. But you seemed so modest about it. You never demanded recognition." "I shouldn't have had to demand recognition, Dad. Not from my own father." We stood in silence at the top of the steps, looking out over the reflecting pool toward the Washington Monument. The space felt appropriately monumental for the conversation we were finally having. "Those Marines at Nadia's ceremony," he said. "When they saluted you. I've never seen anything like that." Military personnel show respect for effective leadership, I said. It's not complicated. But 250 Marines don't organize something like that without serious motivation. No, they don't. He was quiet for a long moment. I robbed you of recognition you deserved, he said finally. Yes, you did. I robbed myself of the chance to be proud of both my daughters. Yes, you did. Another silence, longer this time. Is it too late to change that? I looked at him in the memorial's dramatic lighting, this man who'd shaped my understanding of family loyalty, who'd taught me to work hard and serve others, but who'd somehow managed to remain blind to the fruits of his own teaching. I don't know, Dad. Maybe. But change would require you to see me clearly, consistently, over time. Not just when public embarrassment forces your attention. I want to try. Wanting isn't enough. You've had 30 years to try. I'm not going to manage your efforts anymore. The conversation ended there, with honesty instead of false comfort, with clear boundaries instead of performative reconciliation. Whether Dad would actually change remained to be seen. Whether our relationship could survive 3 decades of willful dismissal was an open question. But for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't invested in the outcome. I'd built a career that provided recognition and satisfaction independent of family approval. I'd earned the respect of colleagues and subordinates who understood the value of my contributions. I no longer needed Dad's validation to know my worth. The girl who'd once hoped for his pride had become a woman who no longer required it. 5 years have passed since Nadia's promotion ceremony. The video of those Marines saluting me has been viewed hundreds of thousands of times online, shared across military social media networks, used in leadership training courses. It's become a symbol of something, recognition delayed, respect finally acknowledged, the moment truth becomes undeniable. I'm a full colonel now, serving as Deputy Director of Joint Logistics Operations, responsible for coordinating supply chains supporting military operations across 4 geographic combatant commands. My decisions affect resource allocation for over 200,000 service members worldwide. When natural disasters require military response, when humanitarian crises demand immediate logistics support, when combat operations need sustained supply lines, my office coordinates the movement of personnel and materials that make mission success possible. The work fulfills me in ways I couldn't have imagined during those early years of seeking Dad's approval. Every successful operation, every crisis averted, every mission supplied without disruption validates the career path I chose despite his dismissal. Dad has tried, in his way, to rebuild our relationship. He calls monthly now, asks detailed questions about my responsibilities, shares articles about military logistics he finds online. The effort is genuine but feels somewhat hollow, motivated more by guilt than authentic interest. I saw a news story about the hurricane relief operation in Puerto Rico, he said during our last conversation. Were you involved in coordinating that? I led the logistics planning for the entire operation, I replied. The article said it was the most complex humanitarian response in decades. It was challenging. Multiple agencies, international coordination, urgent timelines. You must be proud of how it went. The statement hung between us, his attempt to acknowledge achievements he'd missed in real time. I appreciated the effort, but recognition after the fact feels different from support during the struggle. Nadia and I maintain a strong relationship now, built on mutual respect rather than the old dynamics of helper and helped. She's thriving as a major, leading Marines with the competence Dad always recognized in her. But she understands now that she wasn't the only military success in our family, just the only one he chose to see. I think about that ceremony sometimes, she told me during her last visit to Washington. How different things might have been if Dad had paid attention to your career from the beginning. Different, maybe, but not necessarily better. I learned to find satisfaction in the work itself, not in external validation. That's probably made me a more effective leader. Still, you deserved recognition. I got it. Just not from the people I expected. The Marines who organized that salute at her ceremony weren't making a political statement or staging a public protest. They were showing respect for an officer who'd earned it through competent service, acknowledging leadership that had kept them supplied and operational in challenging conditions. Their recognition mattered more than family approval because it was based on professional assessment rather than emotional obligation. My current assignment brings me into contact with senior military leadership regularly. I brief four-star generals, coordinate with cabinet-level officials, participate in strategic planning sessions that shape national security policy. These interactions provide professional satisfaction that transcends personal validation. Last month, the Commandant of the Marine Corps personally thanked me for logistics support during a complex evacuation operation. "Your coordination probably saved hundreds of lives," he said after a Pentagon briefing. "Outstanding work, Colonel." That recognition, specific, earned, based on measurable outcomes, means more than 30 years of seeking Dad's pride ever could. The family dynamics have settled into a new equilibrium. Dad acknowledges my achievements now, sometimes awkwardly, always belatedly, but consistently. He's learned to ask informed questions about my work, to show appropriate pride when others inquire about his daughter's military careers, to avoid the casual dismissiveness that characterized our relationship for so long. But the fundamental damage remains. Trust, once broken by decades of willful blindness, doesn't rebuild easily. I respond to his efforts with polite appreciation, but the emotional investment I once had in his opinion has been permanently altered. Mom observes these interactions with quiet sadness, understanding that something essential was lost in those years of dismissal. She tries sometimes to facilitate deeper reconciliation between Dad and me, suggesting family trips or extended visits that might restore intimacy to our relationship. "He really is proud of you now," she told me during my last visit home. "He talks about your career constantly. Shows people articles about military logistics, explains what you do." "I'm glad he finally understands my work," I said. "But understanding it now doesn't erase 30 years of dismissing it. Can you find a way to forgive him?" Forgiveness implies he's asked for it directly, acknowledged the full scope of his mistakes, committed to sustained change. Dad has done none of these things. He's adjusted his behavior out of embarrassment rather than repentance, modified his treatment of me to avoid future public humiliation rather than because he genuinely regrets past dismissal. The relationship we have now is cordial, functional, appropriate for adult family members who share history but limited emotional intimacy. It's not the relationship I once wanted, but it's the relationship his choices made inevitable. I don't regret the years I spent seeking his recognition. Those experiences taught me to find validation in the work itself, to build professional identity independent of family approval, to measure success by competence rather than external praise. These lessons have served me well in military service, where performance matters more than politics, where results trump recognition. The moment those Marines entered Nadia's promotion ceremony and saluted me wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about truth finally becoming visible, about respect earned through service being acknowledged publicly. The satisfaction I felt wasn't schadenfreude at Dad's embarrassment, but relief that pretense was no longer necessary. For 30 years, I'd maintained the fiction that his dismissal didn't matter, that I didn't need his approval, that I could build a fulfilling life despite his blindness to my achievements. The Marine salute proved these weren't just coping mechanisms or defensive rationalizations. They were accurate assessments of my professional worth and personal resilience. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive through apologies or reconciliation. Sometimes it comes in moments of undeniable truth, witnessed by everyone who matters, impossible to explain away or minimize. 250 Marines standing at attention, saluting in perfect unison, acknowledging leadership earned through competent service. Dad's hands shook that day not from fear, but from recognition that his narrative about his daughters had been fundamentally wrong for decades. The story he'd told himself and others, successful Nadia, helpful younger sister, collapsed in the face of evidence he couldn't ignore. That was justice enough. The unexpected consequences of that ceremony continue to ripple outward, years later. The video has become something of a phenomenon in military circles, shared in leadership courses and professional development seminars. I've been invited to speak at military academies about logistics coordination, crisis management, and the often invisible nature of essential support operations. Last month, I addressed cadets at West Point about the reality of military leadership. You'll hear a lot about combat leadership, I told them. About leading troops under fire, making split-second tactical decisions, inspiring courage in desperate situations. That's important. But most of military leadership happens in quieter moments, in planning sessions and coordination meetings and logistics briefings. The decisions that keep operations running, that ensure missions succeed, that bring people home safely. After the presentation, a young cadet approached me. "Ma'am, my father's in logistics too. Army Supply Corps. But he always talks about his job like it's not real military service." "What do you tell him?" I asked. "Nothing, ma'am." I didn't know what to say. Tell him that logistics is the foundation everything else stands on. Without supply lines, without coordination, without the systems that move people and materials where they need to be, combat operations fail. Tell him his work matters. The conversation reminded me of my younger self, hungry for that kind of validation from someone who understood the complexity and importance of the work. The cadet's father probably deserved better recognition from his family, just as I had from mine. These speaking engagements have become a significant part of my role now. The Pentagon uses me as a representative voice for logistics operations, someone who can articulate the strategic importance of supply chain management to both military and civilian audiences. It's ironic that Dad's decades of dismissal led indirectly to this platform for advocacy and education. The professional recognition extends beyond military circles. Harvard Business School invited me to guest lecture on crisis management and complex systems coordination. My case studies from military logistics operations have been adapted for civilian supply chain management courses. The skills Dad dismissed as paper-pushing have applications far beyond military service. "Your father must be incredibly proud now," the Harvard dean said after my lecture on managing supply chains during natural disasters. "He's learning to be," I replied diplomatically. "The truth is more complicated." Dad's pride now feels performative, displayed for others rather than felt genuinely. He's learned to brag about my achievements, but in ways that suggest he's still processing what they actually mean. He tells people I'm a high-ranking Pentagon official without understanding the specific responsibilities that title encompasses. Nadia handles family dynamics with more emotional intelligence than I expected. She's genuinely supportive of my career advancement, but she also understands the awkwardness our changed relationship creates for Dad. "He doesn't know how to be proud of both of us simultaneously," she observed during Thanksgiving dinner last year. For 30 years, I was his military success story. Now he's trying to figure out how to accommodate two successful military daughters without admitting he ignored one of them. "He doesn't have to admit anything," I said. "He just has to treat us both with appropriate respect." "But acknowledgement without admission feels hollow, doesn't it?" She was right. Dad's current behavior represents accommodation rather than genuine change. He's modified his treatment of me to avoid future embarrassment, but he hasn't truly reckoned with the implications of 30 years of dismissal. The most significant change has been in how extended family and family friends interact with me. People who witnessed Dad's condescending treatment for years have had to recalibrate their understanding of our family dynamics. They see now that his confident assessments of my career were based on ignorance rather than insider knowledge. At my cousin's wedding last summer, relatives who hadn't seen me in years approached with mixtures of curiosity and embarrassment. They remembered Dad's dismissive comments about my work, his casual relegation of my achievements to supporting roles. Now they wanted to understand what a deputy director of joint logistics operations actually does. "I always wondered why you were so quiet about your job," my aunt said. "Now I realize you weren't quiet. We just weren't listening properly." The observation stung because it was accurate. I had tried to explain my work, my responsibilities, my career progression. But Dad's narrative framework was so dominant that even well-meaning relatives processed my explanations through his lens of dismissal. My uncle, a retired teacher, was more direct. "Your father really didn't understand what you did he?" "He understood what he wanted to understand," I replied. That must have been incredibly frustrating. It was. But the frustration taught me valuable lessons about self-reliance, about finding satisfaction in the work rather than in recognition, about building professional identity independent of family validation. These lessons have served me throughout my military career. The most meaningful recognition comes from the people I've worked with over the years. Former colleagues reach out regularly, updating me on their careers, asking for professional advice, expressing appreciation for mentorship they received while working under my command. A major who served in my logistics coordination office during the Afghanistan drawdown sent me a promotion announcement last month. "Colonel, you taught me that logistics officers are force multipliers," she wrote. "Every successful operation we coordinated together reminded me that our decisions had direct impact on mission success and personnel safety. Thank you for showing me that support operations require just as much leadership skill as combat operations." These messages validate my career in ways family recognition never could. They represent professional assessment from people who understand the complexity of military logistics, who've seen the consequences of effective and ineffective coordination, who appreciate competent leadership because they've worked under it. The relationship with Dad continues to evolve slowly, sometimes awkwardly. He makes genuine efforts now to understand my work, asks informed questions, shows interest in my professional challenges. But 30 years of dismissal created damage that good intentions alone cannot repair. During our most recent conversation, he mentioned meeting another military parent at a community event. "His daughter's a logistics officer too," Dad said. "I told him how important that work is, how much responsibility logistics coordination involves." "That's good, Dad. I think I finally understand what you've been doing all these years." The statement revealed both progress and persistent limitation. Dad was learning to appreciate logistics operations in general, but his understanding of my specific career remained abstract. He could now acknowledge that logistics was important work, but he still couldn't articulate what my particular role involved or why my advancement was significant. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps decades of willful blindness can't be completely overcome, only gradually ameliorated through sustained effort and honest conversation. Perhaps the relationship we have now, cordial, respectful, but emotionally distant, is the best possible outcome given the history we share. The girl who once desperately wanted Dad's recognition has become a woman who finds fulfillment in professional competence and peer respect. The validation I once sought from him comes now from the Marines I've supported, the operations I've coordinated, the crises I've managed successfully. That's a better foundation for self-worth than family approval ever could have been. Sometimes the greatest gift dismissive people give us is the motivation to prove them wrong, not for their satisfaction, but for our own growth and achievement. Growing up, I learned early that my job was to make everyone else look good. Dad made this clear without ever saying it directly. At family barbecues, he'd introduce my sister with a chest-puffed pride that filled the entire backyard. "This is Nadia," he'd announce to neighbors and relatives, his hand resting on her shoulder like she was his trophy. "Honor roll again this semester. Track team captain. College scouts are already calling." Then his eyes would find me, standing off to the side with a plate of burgers I'd helped grill. "And this one," he'd add with a chuckle, "she keeps the rest of us fed." Everyone would laugh. Nadia would beam. I'd force a smile and disappear back into the kitchen. This wasn't cruelty exactly. Dad wasn't a monster. He provided for us, showed up to both our school events, never missed a birthday. But somewhere along the way, he decided Nadia was destined for greatness, and I was destined to help her get there. The roles felt carved in stone before I was old enough to question them. Nadia was 3 years older, naturally athletic, effortlessly popular. She had Dad's confidence and Mom's grace. I was quieter, more methodical, the one who remembered everyone's schedules and made sure homework got done. When Nadia needed rides to early morning track practice, I got up at 5:30 to drive her. When she struggled with chemistry junior year, I spent nights explaining molecular bonds until she understood. When she wanted to apply for summer leadership camps but couldn't afford the fees, I worked double shifts at the diner and handed over my savings without being asked. Dad praised Nadia's achievements as if they materialized from thin air. He never seemed to notice the scaffolding I built around them. Nadia's so focused, he'd tell relatives over Sunday dinner. So driven. You can just see she's going places. I'd sit across from him, cutting my roast beef into smaller and smaller pieces, wondering if he remembered who drove Nadia to every track meet, who helped her fill out college applications, who listened to her practice speeches for student government elections until I could recite them myself. The pattern held through high school and into college. Nadia chose a prestigious university 6 hours away. Dad helped her move into the dorms, took pictures of her in front of the administration building, posted them on Facebook with captions about his future leader. When I graduated valedictorian from our local community college 2 years later, he attended the ceremony, but left early for Nadia's lacrosse game. Community college is smart, he told people when they asked about my plans. Practical. Not everyone needs to be the star. I transferred to state school the following fall, majoring in logistics and supply chain management. It wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it. I understood how systems worked, how to move resources efficiently, how to solve problems other people didn't see coming. Dad called it support work when relatives asked what I was studying. Nadia joined the Marines after college. Dad's pride reached new heights. He bought Marine Corps decals for his truck, started wearing a Marine Dad hat to the grocery store, peppered his conversations with military terminology he'd Googled. When Nadia completed basic training, he threw her a party and invited half the town. When I got my first job coordinating supply chains for a defense contractor, he mentioned it once over dessert and changed the subject. The imbalance became my normal. I stopped expecting recognition and started finding satisfaction in the work itself. My job was interesting, demanding, important in ways Dad didn't understand. I managed complex logistics networks, ensured critical supplies reached the right places at the right times. People's lives depended on the systems I built and maintained. But Dad saw it as pushing papers. Nadia's career advanced quickly. She earned commendations, led squads, got promoted ahead of schedule. Dad memorized her rank insignia and corrected people who got them wrong. At family dinners, he'd steer every conversation toward her latest deployment or training exercise. Tell them about the leadership course, Nadia, he'd prompt. Tell them what your commanding officer said. Nadia would recount her experiences while Dad nodded along like a proud coach. Then he'd turn to me with obligatory politeness. How's your job going? The question always felt perfunctory, like he was checking a box. When I tried to explain the challenges of coordinating international supply chains or managing crisis logistics, his eyes would glaze over. That's nice, honey, he'd say, already looking back at Nadia. The diminishment happened so gradually I barely noticed it was happening. Family stories got rewritten over time. The night I stayed up helping Nadia study for her military aptitude test became Nadia's dedication paid off. The money I contributed for her officer candidate school expenses became Nadia's initiative in finding funding. The care packages I assembled and shipped during her first deployment became the family support. I wasn't angry exactly. Anger would have been cleaner. Instead, I felt invisible, like I was watching my own life from the outside. I had a successful career, good relationships, a life I'd built on my own terms. But at family gatherings, I became the supporting character in someone else's story. Maybe that's why I kept trying. Each holiday, each birthday, each family celebration, some part of me hoped this would be the time Dad noticed what I'd accomplished. Not in comparison to Nadia, not as consolation prize, but as something worth celebrating on its own merit. It never happened. Dad's vision of who we were had hardened into fact. Nadia was the star. I was the helper. He saw what he expected to see, nothing more. So when Nadia's promotion ceremony invitation arrived, embossed and formal, requesting the honor of my presence as she advanced to major, I RSVP'd yes, like I always did. I pressed my dress uniform, polished my insignia, prepared to smile and clap and blend into the background while Dad beamed at his golden child. I just didn't know that this time, the background was going to step forward. Nadia's commission as major came with all the ceremony Dad had dreamed of. The invitation arrived on heavy cardstock, gold embossed, requesting the honor of our presence at Camp Pendleton for the formal promotion ceremony. Dad immediately cleared his calendar and started planning the weekend like a military campaign himself. "This is huge," he told everyone who would listen. "Major. You know what that means? She's commanding hundreds of people now. Real leadership responsibility." He bought a new suit for the occasion, researched military protocol online, practiced saluting in the bathroom mirror when he thought no one was watching. Mom rolled her eyes, but she was proud too. Nadia had worked hard for this. She deserved the recognition. I took leave from my job and made arrangements to attend. My own work had been particularly demanding lately, a series of supply chain disruptions in the Pacific that required constant coordination with military logistics teams. I'd been working 18-hour days, managing real-time crises, ensuring critical supplies reached forward operating bases without delay. But this was Nadia's moment. Family came first. The pattern was already forming before we left home. Dad peppered his conversations with military terminology, dropping phrases like chain of command and operational readiness that he'd clearly researched. He'd started a story 3 times about Nadia's natural leadership qualities, how her commanding officers had always seen something special in her. "Some people are born to lead," he'd say, glancing at me with that familiar mix of affection and dismissal. "Others are born to support. Both important, but different." I'd nod and change the subject. The drive to California took 2 days. Dad spent most of it quizzing Nadia about military customs, asking her to explain the significance of her new rank, discussing her future career trajectory. I drove the second shift while Nadia napped in the passenger seat, listening to Dad plan her next promotion from the back seat. "Colonel's not out of reach," he was saying. "Not for someone with your record. The Marines need officers who understand real leadership." When we stopped for gas, Dad bought a Marine Dad t-shirt and wore it for the rest of the trip. Camp Pendleton was impressive in its scale and precision. Rows of identical buildings stretched toward distant mountains, everything maintained with military exactness. Nadia led us through the base like she owned it, pointing out landmarks, explaining protocols, clearly comfortable in this environment she'd claimed as her own. "This is where I did my officer training," she said, indicating a complex of buildings that looked indistinguishable from the others to me. 12 weeks of pure hell, but it made me who I am. Dad nodded solemnly, as if she'd shared classified intelligence. We checked into the base guest quarters and spent the evening at the Officers' Club, where Nadia introduced us to her colleagues. Dad shook hands with enthusiasm, asking detailed questions about Marine operations, clearly trying to demonstrate his insider knowledge. Everyone was polite, professional. They respected Nadia, spoke highly of her leadership style, her tactical thinking, her ability to inspire her Marines. "She's exactly what this corps needs," her commanding officer told Dad over dinner. "Natural leader. Her Marines would follow her anywhere." Dad glowed like he'd personally trained her. I sat at the table, making small talk with the other family members, watching Dad bask in reflected glory. No one asked about my work. No one inquired about my own military connections, my security clearance, my role in keeping their supply lines operational. I was Nadia's sister, the family member who'd come to watch her succeed. The ceremony was scheduled for the following afternoon. We spent the morning at the base exchange, where Dad bought Nadia a commemorative plaque and had me take pictures of them together in front of every Marine Corps symbol we encountered. Nadia was gracious about it, patient with his enthusiasm, but I caught her checking her watch when he wasn't looking. "He's proud," I told her while Dad examined military memorabilia. "I know," she said. "Sometimes I feel like I'm carrying his dreams along with my own." It was the first time I'd heard her acknowledge the weight of his expectations. For a moment, I wondered if she felt as trapped by his narratives as I did, just from the other side. But then Dad returned with a Marine Corps flag he wanted to give to Nadia's unit, and she smiled and thanked him, and the moment passed. The ceremony itself was scheduled for 1,400 hours in the base's main parade ground. We arrived early and found seats in the family section, Dad positioning himself for optimal photograph angles. Other families filled the rows around us, everyone dressed in their finest clothes, cameras ready. Nadia looked impressive in her dress uniform, confident and professional as she took her place with the other officers being promoted. Dad couldn't stop taking pictures, even during the formal proceedings. Other family members whispered complaints, but he was oblivious, focused entirely on capturing every moment of Nadia's triumph. The ceremony proceeded according to military protocol, formal and precise. Officers advanced when called, received their new insignia, saluted their superiors, returned to formation. Nadia's moment came midway through the proceedings. Her name was called, she stepped forward, received her major's leaves, saluted crisply, and returned to position. Dad applauded louder than anyone else in the family section. Afterward, during the reception, relatives and family friends clustered around Nadia to offer congratulations. Dad positioned himself at her elbow, accepting thanks as if he'd personally engineered her success. He retold stories of her childhood determination, her natural leadership qualities, her destiny to serve. I stood nearby, smiling when people made eye contact, offering polite congratulations when addressed directly. The supporting cast playing my familiar role. That's when Dad's voice carried across the reception area, louder than he probably intended, but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Your sister is the success story," he announced, patting my head like I was still 12 years old. His hand rested there for a beat too long, heavy with condescension. "Just try not to embarrass her." The words hit like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, Dad rarely intended cruelty, but because they were so casually dismissive, delivered with such thoughtless certainty. Around us, conversations paused. Family friends chuckled nervously. Someone's camera flashed. I stood there in my dress uniform, 32 years old, decorated officer, essential personnel in operations that kept Marines supplied and alive in combat zones. And my father patted my head like a pet. The humiliation wasn't just personal. It was professional. I was in uniform, representing my service, my rank, my record. The other officers present weren't just watching a family moment. They were witnessing my father publicly diminish a fellow service member at a military ceremony. Nadia's face flushed red. She started to speak, probably to deflect or defend, but Dad was already moving on, turning back to her commanding officer with some question about deployment schedules. The moment passed for everyone except me. I felt 20 years of suppressed frustration crystallize into something harder and cleaner. Not anger, exactly. Recognition. This was who Dad was. This was who he'd always been. All my hoping for acknowledgement, all my patient waiting for him to see me clearly, had been wasted energy. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. The reception continued around me. People resumed their conversations. Nadia accepted more congratulations. Dad basked in reflected pride. I stood in the middle of it all, invisible except as a punchline. That's when the double doors at the back of the reception hall opened. The first Marine through was a gunnery sergeant, his dress blues immaculate, his bearing unmistakably command presence. Behind him came another Marine, then another, then a stream of them flowing through the doorway in perfect formation. They weren't guests or casual attendees. They were moving with purpose, organizing themselves with military precision. Conversations died. Cameras stopped clicking. Everyone in the reception hall turned to watch as more Marines entered, forming ranks with practiced efficiency. 50, then 100, then more still coming through the doors. Dad stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open slightly. Nadia's commanding officer straightened, clearly confused, but respectful of whatever was happening. The other families pressed back against the walls, making space for the growing formation. 200 Marines now filled the center of the reception hall, standing at perfect attention. Then 50 more entered, completing the formation. 250 Marines, organized in precise rows, facing the spot where I stood. The gunnery sergeant who'd led them in approached me directly, his eyes locked on mine. He came to attention 3 feet away and saluted with parade ground precision. "Colonel Fletcher," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "Permission to present your Marines." "Colonel." My rank, my title, spoken with absolute respect and formality. Around me, the silence deepened. Dad's hand, which had been reaching for another canopy, froze halfway to the table. I returned the gunnery sergeant's salute, my own movements automatic, trained by years of military service. Permission granted, Gunny. He executed a perfect about-face and called the formation to attention. 250 voices responded as one, a 10 HUT. Then, in unison, every Marine in that hall rendered a salute. Not to Nadia, not to her commanding officers, not to anyone else in the room. To me. The silence was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. Dad's face had gone completely white, his hands visibly shaking. Nadia stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, surprise, confusion, maybe something like awe. The salute held for exactly the right duration, neither hurried nor prolonged. Then, on the gunnery sergeant's command, 250 hands dropped in perfect synchronization. Marines from the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit, 3rd Marine Logistics Group, and 1st Supply Battalion, the gunnery sergeant announced. Colonel Fletcher has kept us supplied, armed, and mission-ready across 4 deployments. When we needed ammunition, she got it there. When we needed medical supplies, she got them there. When we needed water in the desert and parts in the field, she got them there. He paused, letting his words sink in. Colonel Fletcher, these Marines wanted to personally thank you for bringing them home alive. Another pause. Then, spontaneously, someone in the formation began to clap. Others joined. Within seconds, 250 Marines were applauding, not with polite ceremony reception courtesy, but with genuine appreciation, the kind reserved for officers who'd earned their respect through competence and sacrifice. The applause went on for a full minute. Dad stood frozen, his mouth still slightly open, his face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and something approaching fear. Other family members pressed back against the walls, their own conversations forgotten. Nadia's promotion ceremony had become secondary to whatever was happening to her sister. When the applause finally died, the gunnery sergeant addressed me again. "Ma'am, if you'd like to walk the formation, the Marines would consider it an honor." I looked out at 250 faces, all focused on me with unmistakable respect. These weren't strangers. They were Marines I'd supported, supplied, kept operational across multiple deployments. Some of them I'd coordinated with directly during crisis situations. Others had benefited from logistics networks I designed and maintained. They knew my work. They knew my record. They knew what I'd accomplished. I'd be honored, Gunny. I walked the formation slowly, making eye contact, acknowledging individual Marines who stepped slightly forward as I passed. Some I recognized from secure video calls during operational crises. Others were faces from convoy rosters and supply requisitions. All of them represented operations where my decisions had real consequences. Behind me, the reception hall remained silent. Dad hadn't moved from his spot beside the refreshment table. Nadia watched from her position near the family seating area. Everyone else simply stared. When I'd walked the entire formation, I returned to my starting position. The gunnery sergeant called the Marines back to attention, then dismissed them with crisp efficiency. They filed out through the same doors they'd entered, maintaining formation until they disappeared from view. The hall stayed quiet for several seconds after the last Marine left. Then conversations resumed, but differently now, subdued, confused, charged with questions no one wanted to ask directly. Dad approached me slowly, his face still pale, his hands steadier but not steady. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "About your rank. About all that." I looked at him for a long moment. 3 decades of being patted on the head, dismissed as support staff, introduced as the one who keeps everyone fed. 3 decades of watching him beam with pride over Nadia while treating my accomplishments as clerical work. "Colonel," I said simply. "I've been a colonel for 2 years, Dad." He flinched like I'd slapped him. Around us, people were still whispering, pointing discreetly, clearly trying to process what they'd witnessed. Nadia's commanding officer kept glancing between us, probably recalculating everything he thought he knew about our family dynamics. "Why didn't you tell me?" Dad asked. The question was so fundamentally wrong that I almost laughed. I'd tried to tell him. I'd tried to explain my work, my responsibilities, my advancement. But he heard what he wanted to hear, saw what fit his predetermined narrative. I did tell you, I said. You just never listened. Nadia appeared at my elbow, still in her dress uniform, her new major's insignia catching the light. She looked shaken, uncertain, like the ground beneath her feet had shifted without warning. How many Marines was that? She asked quietly. 250, I replied. They came here just for you? Apparently. She was quiet for a moment, processing. I've never seen anything like that. The coordination alone. I nodded. Logistics. Dad was still standing there, opening and closing his mouth like a fish. Other family members began approaching tentatively, their expressions mixing embarrassment with curiosity. Everyone had witnessed his dismissive comment. Everyone had seen the Marine's response. We should probably get some air, Nadia suggested. The three of us walked outside to a small patio area adjacent to the reception hall. Dad sat heavily on a bench, his new suit wrinkled, his face still processing what had happened. A colonel, he said, more to himself than to us. You're a colonel. Supply chain management, I said. Operational logistics. Crisis coordination. The paper-pushing job you've been making jokes about for years. He winced again. Nadia sat beside him, her own celebration forgotten. Those Marines. They really came just to thank you. They came to show respect, I corrected. There's a difference. Dad looked up at me, his eyes clearer now but filled with something I'd never seen there before. Fear, maybe. Or recognition of how badly he'd miscalculated. I'm sorry, he said, and for the first time in 30 years, he sounded like he meant it. I studied his face, looking for the dismissiveness, the casual condescension, the automatic deflection to Nadia's accomplishments. It wasn't there. The Marines had changed something fundamental. The public nature of my recognition had made my military service real to him in a way my own words never could. Are you? I asked. He nodded, then seemed to realize nodding wasn't enough. I've been. I didn't understand. I thought your job was support work. You've said that many times. I was wrong. Nadia was watching us both, her own ceremony forgotten. Her promotion to major, which should have been the highlight of the weekend, had been overshadowed by the revelation of her sister's rank and record. How long have you been coordinating with Marines in the field? She asked. 6 years. Since I got my security clearance upgraded. And you never. Never what? I tried to explain my work. Dad called it logistics. He wasn't wrong, technically. But he made it sound like filing paperwork instead of keeping people alive. Dad's hands were shaking again, but with emotion now rather than shock. Those Marines. When they said you brought them home alive. That's what logistics means in military context, Dad. Making sure the right supplies reach the right people at the right time. Medical supplies, ammunition, water, equipment. When Marines are pinned down in hostile territory, someone has to coordinate getting them what they need to survive. That someone has been me, more often than you'd think. Silence stretched between us. In the distance, we could hear the reception continuing, conversations resuming, normal social interactions proceeding. But our family dynamic had shifted permanently. The story Dad had been telling about his daughters, successful Nadia and helpful younger sister, had been revealed as fiction. I should have known, he said finally. You could have known. You chose not to ask. The truth hung between us, uncomfortable and undeniable. Dad had built his identity around being Nadia's proud military father. He'd worn Marine Dad shirts, learned military terminology, basked in her reflected glory. But he'd never bothered to learn what his other daughter actually did for the military he claimed to support. Nadia stood up, smoothing her uniform. We should probably go back inside. People will be wondering. I looked at her, then at Dad. You go ahead. I need a few minutes. They left me alone on the patio, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not vindication, not satisfaction, but relief. The performance was over. The careful balance of supporting Nadia while minimizing myself, of accepting Dad's narrative while building my own life, of pretending his dismissal didn't matter. 250 Marines had just told a room full of people exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished. There was no taking that back, no rewriting that story, no explaining it away. When I finally returned to the reception, conversation stopped briefly as people noticed me, then resumed with careful politeness. Dad stayed close to Nadia, probably trying to recalibrate his understanding of our family hierarchy. Nadia accepted congratulations on her promotion while fielding questions about her sister's surprise appearance and rank. The rest of the weekend passed quietly. Dad made tentative attempts at conversation, asking careful questions about my work, clearly trying to demonstrate newfound interest. I answered politely but without enthusiasm. 30 years of dismissal couldn't be erased by one afternoon of shock and apology. The flight home was different. Dad sat between Nadia and me, no longer monopolizing conversation with stories of Nadia's accomplishments. Instead, he asked me about deployment logistics, about crisis management, about the Marines who'd appeared at the ceremony. His questions felt genuine but tentative, like he was afraid of revealing more ignorance. "How often do you coordinate with active operations?" he asked as our plane leveled off over Nevada. "Daily," I replied. "Sometimes hourly during active deployments." He processed this information with visible effort. "And that's been your job for 6 years in crisis coordination. 8 years total in military logistics." 8 years. I watched him do the math, realizing how long he'd been dismissing work that involved life-and-death decisions for active service members. Nadia was quiet during most of the flight, occasionally glancing between Dad and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her promotion weekend had been hijacked by revelations about her sister, but she didn't seem resentful. More like she was seeing our family dynamic from the outside for the first time. Back home, word spread quickly. Camp Pendleton wasn't exactly local news, but military ceremonies sometimes generated social media posts, and Dad's friends from the Marine Corps League had questions. Someone had taken video of the Marines entering the reception hall. Within days, the footage was circulating online, generating comments and speculation. Dad stopped wearing his Marine dad hat. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. At family dinners, relatives who'd previously focused exclusively on Nadia's career began asking about my work. Dad's usual deflection tactics, changing the subject, minimizing my responses, steering conversation back to Nadia, no longer worked. Too many people had seen the video. Too many people now knew exactly what logistics meant in military context. "So you're the one who gets supplies to the troops overseas?" my uncle asked during Sunday dinner 2 weeks after the ceremony. "Among other things," I said. "That's got to be incredibly complicated. All those moving parts, different time zones, enemy interference." I nodded, aware of Dad sitting across from me, listening to a conversation he'd never allowed before. "Life and death stuff," my uncle continued. "One mistake and people don't come home. That's why there are protocols," I said. "Redundancies. Multiple verification systems." Dad's fork paused halfway to his mouth. For 30 years, he'd heard me describe my work and translated it as paperwork. Now he was realizing that paperwork meant inventory systems that kept Marines armed and fed in hostile territory. The changes weren't limited to family interactions. Neighbors who'd known me since childhood began seeing me differently. The local VFW post, which had always acknowledged my service with polite nods, suddenly wanted to know about my deployment experiences. The bank teller asked about my military career instead of just processing my deposits. Most significantly, Nadia's relationship with me began to shift. She started calling more often, asking questions about military life from a perspective I'd never expected. "I've been thinking about that ceremony," she said during one of our conversations. "Those Marines didn't just show up randomly. Someone organized that." "Probably several someones," I agreed. "Which means they know you personally. Trust you. Respect your judgment enough to participate in something like that." I waited for her to continue. "I've been in the Marines for 8 years," she said. "I've never seen anything like what happened at my promotion ceremony. Marines don't do public demonstrations without serious reasons." "No," I agreed. "They don't. So what you do, it's not just logistics. It's leadership. The conversation continued, but I was struck by how long it had taken for Nadia to see what had been obvious to the Marines who worked with me daily. She'd been so embedded in Dad's narrative of our roles that she'd never questioned why I had security clearance, why I worked with classified systems, why my job required constant communication with active operations. Dad's attempts at reconciliation became more frequent but remained awkward. He'd ask about my work, then struggle to process answers that didn't fit his understanding of what support roles involved. He'd try to include me in conversations about military affairs, then reveal his assumption that my experience was clerical rather than operational. "Must be satisfying to know you're helping the mission," he said one evening, clearly trying to show appreciation. "I am the mission," I corrected gently. "When Marines in hostile territory need resupply, I'm not helping someone else coordinate that. I am coordinating it." He blinked, still adjusting his mental framework. The most difficult moments came when he tried to apologize for 30 years of dismissal without fully acknowledging what he was apologizing for. He'd express regret for underestimating my job, but frame it as misunderstanding rather than deliberate diminishment. He'd acknowledge my accomplishments while still searching for ways to preserve Nadia's position as the family success story. "I guess I just didn't realize how important logistics could be," he said during one of these conversations. "You didn't want to realize," I replied. "I tried to explain my work many times. You weren't interested in hearing it." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought Nadia was the military expert in the family. Nadia's an excellent Marine. But she's not the only military expert in this family." The statement hung between us, a simple truth that challenged decades of assumed hierarchy. 3 months after Nadia's promotion ceremony, Dad ran into my former commanding officer at a veterans event. Colonel Martinez had retired from active duty but still worked with military contractors. He recognized Dad from family photos I'd shown him years earlier. "Your daughter's one of the finest officers I've worked with," Colonel Martinez told Dad. "Saved more lives than most people realize. Her crisis management during the Kandahar supply line attacks probably prevented a complete operational failure." Dad came home from that conversation shaken. He'd finally heard my military record described by someone whose opinion he automatically respected, another colonel, someone with combat experience, someone who understood operational complexity. "The Kandahar thing," he said to me that evening. "You never mentioned that." I mentioned it. "You called it a supply chain disruption and changed the subject." He was quiet for a long time. "Colonel Martinez said you probably saved hundreds of lives." "Possibly. It's not really quantifiable." "But you never." "Never what, Dad? Never demanded recognition? Never insisted you pay attention?" I was doing my job. That night, he asked me to explain the Kandahar operation. For the first time in my adult life, he listened to my description of military work without interruption, without deflection, without comparison to Nadia's experiences. He asked technical questions. He wanted to understand the complexity, the pressure, the consequences of failure. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes. "I'm proud of you," he said finally. The words should have meant more. I'd waited 30 years to hear them. But they came too late, offered only after public embarrassment had forced him to confront his own willful blindness. "Thank you," I said, because it seemed like the appropriate response. But I realized I no longer needed his pride to validate my service. That's where I'll leave it. If you've ever dealt with family favoritism or been minimized in public, what did you do, and what changed after you set a boundary? What would you say to my dad in that moment, and what would you tell your younger self? Drop your story in the comments, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this resonated, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. New chapters every week. See you in the next one.